So much of the modern world runs on REST APIs, but is that the only choice? Well, of course it isn't. Today we'll be talking about GraphQL, where it fits in with event streaming, and where you might and might not want to use it. All that and more on today's episode of Streaming Audio. Streaming Audio is brought to you by Confluent Developer. That's developer.confluent.io, which is the one-stop website to teach you everything you need to know about Apache Kafka, event streaming, event-driven architectures and systems. You'll find getting started guides, which will teach you how to connect your language to Kafka, all the way up to high-level architectural patterns of how you should build event-driven systems, and then back down into the guts of Kafka to teach you about the internals of how it works under the hood. You'll also find plenty of educational courses which you can walk through with Confluent Cloud. If you choose to do that, sign up to Confluent Cloud with the code podcast100 and you'll get $100 of extra free credit to play around with. With that said, let's start today's episode. I'm your host, Chris Jenkins, for another episode of Streaming Audio. With me today is Gerard Klijs. He's been a back-end engineer for 10 years. He's been working with Kafka for 6 of those. And he's here today to talk to us about GraphQL. Gerard, thank you for coming to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So let me step back and set the scene for people that don't know about GraphQL. So here I am, I'm writing a web server as I've done 100 times before. I run a query against the backend, I get an object back, I serialize it to JSON, and I spit it out over my REST API. Why should I step back and consider GraphQL in that chain?
There could be several reasons, but one of the most important ones, I think, is also why Facebook, the company that kind of invented GraphQL, started it. And sometimes you really want to support all the clients. In the case of Facebook, that could be many different applications and also things like Android apps. People might not always update those. And then once they request data, so for example, you have a name field, and at a later point, you decide it becomes first name and last name. So then with GraphQL, you have to say which data you want to get. So that means that if I deprecate the get name and I introduce get first name, get last name, then server side, they could exactly see, oh, this field is still being used, even though we deprecated it. So we don't throw away that code yet. And then it becomes more graceful to deprecate things than if you would have something like REST. Because then, for example, you would have one payload that has just the name one, and then you probably call it v1, because otherwise, if you don't version it, then the old clients will break. And then you have a v2 version, and that has the first name and the last name as separate fields. And that's fine, but then you still don't know from the clients that ask for the V1 version what they really use, because then there might be 30 fields in there, and probably maybe they only need one. And that's another one that's overfetching. Like maybe for some reason it's only want to display the name, but you return a JSON with 30 fields. Then they have to ask that JSON with those 30 fields just to get the name part. I mean, GraphQL, you can say, I just want the name, and just use that to display something.
Right, so it's partly migration, but it's also kind of analytics on the API. You can see which fields are used a lot, which fields are perhaps completely useless.
Yes, and that makes migration a lot easier.
Oh, God, yeah, I can imagine. Interesting. So let's get a sense of the shape of how you actually use it. So it's not like REST where your URI tells the server what you want, right?
Yes. So more often the actual implementation uses posts, and then you have an object that can be can become quite big, and in there you really define sort of a graph of what you want to have. So in this case, for example, for the name part, it could be that you say I want a person based on some ID, and then from that person, I just want to have the name value. And then what you get back is a proper JSON with person and then name and then some name.
And you can also dig further down. So I could say I want a person and their address, and I want the address to be resolved to a latitude, longitude.
Yes, for example,
So
or
go
I want his
deeper into that graph.
friends and the friends of their friends, or you can make it really crazy queries. This is also one of the risks, but yeah.
Right. Does that feels like it would lead into sort of different documentation, because you wouldn't, in a REST API, you often want to know the shape of the thing coming back, but in GraphQL, you're often in the state where the question you ask determines the shape of the thing coming back. So it's more in your control, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You can also fully control things. Like I said, even when you're query for a person, and maybe for some reason you want to have it as JSON back as, I don't know, important person, then you could also say, I want to query this as an important person, but I want to call the person thing, and then you get a JSON back with important person in it. So it's very variable also with how you want to get the JSON back.
So you can do like renaming on the fly to suit you as a client.
Yeah, or you could, for example, query for 3 persons at the same time with the same query. And then, of course, you have to give them names so you know which is which. But things like that you can also do.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So you're not restricted to, say, getting one user out or all the users out. You can say, I want these 3 because it's mother, father, child. Right. Okay. Yeah. I see how that would work. How do people typically get started with this?
One of the things you often see is that mostly the front-end team is getting kind of frustrated. For example, with the backend team is often late with changing things, or is changing things without communicating, and then things start breaking, for example.
Yeah.
So then they start building a BFF that's called a backend for frontend, where they will they put it in between, and then they typically consume REST, since most of it's still REST, and they will at the server level kind of transform it into a GraphQL endpoint, and then translate every so all that queries coming in to REST calls, combine them together, and throw them back to the clients.
Right. So I don't have to throw away my old REST client. I can build this on top as a kind of more flexible query.
There are multiple ways to build REST APIs onto GraphQL.
Okay. That's interesting. And my other big question, I think, is it just for querying, or can I, if I need to create a new user, is that handled similarly?
Yeah, so typically, like, I always find it a bit confusing with REST, because I think typical REST, you have like 7 type of operations, and GraphQL just has, and then it's always a debate whether which one it really should be.
There's always someone on the team who's the true believer in the right REST way, right?
Yes, so things like that. So with GraphQL, it's pretty easy. So you have queries. They shouldn't change anything, and they typically ask for asking for specific information. Then you have mutations. So they do change anything, and because they can change anything, it's important if you have multiple mutations in one request that they are executed in order. That's also part of the specification. And then you have subscriptions, which is kind of like streaming APIs.
Ooh, tell me about those, because we're very interested in streaming APIs around here.
Yeah, I understand. So that was also one of my biggest interests to get it working. So the demo application, I didn't mention it, but I once built a demo application of kind of a banking app, I think about 4 years ago with Clojure. And then I used Kafka for the messaging, and you also had a front end, and then all the transactions would be streamed. So you could see them real time popping on your screen using subscriptions. But when I started playing around with different server implementations and client implementations of those subscriptions, I also found some rough edges. So some of them do things just a bit different. And for example, in the Kotlin GraphQL library, I also found some errors. So then I found them myself, and I fixed them and contributed them. So that was kind of nice that I could do something back for the open source community. But yeah, because often people mostly care about the mutations and the queries, and subscriptions are not that often used in production. Also because it's kind of hard to scale them properly.
Yeah. If you've got too many connected clients, right, that can be a challenge.
Yeah, since it's a stateful connection, and yeah.
Yeah, but it's so much nicer when you have like I've worked on UIs where it's all WebSockets, it's all streaming data, and the end user experience is so much nicer when everything's live.
Yes.
So I'm a big fan of doing it when you can. So
So it's
give
also
me some
pretty
gory
common
details.
protocol over WebSockets. So there's like the kind of, but that's kind of the problem, that it's not an official specification of GraphQL over WebSockets, and that kind of says you can implement this like this, and then most of the libraries implement like that, but some like diverge just a bit, and then some clients with some servers, and then it won't work. But, yeah.
Right. So as you move from language to language, which it sounds like you do quite a lot, you get a slightly different
Yes.
experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you've already mentioned Clojure and Kotlin. So, and I know you do some Rust. So
Yes.
we're clearly dealing with a polyglot here.
Yeah, a bit.
Yeah.
For my work, it's still mostly just JVM and mostly just Java. But yeah.
Okay. So give me some gory details. What does subscriptions actually look like? How do I set one up? Is it like running a query or?
Much like it. So, but like I said, the one I have most experience with is over WebSockets. I know there are also some that use server-sent events currently, but I've never used those. So then you set up a WebSocket, and then basically you also have like something like a running query. And something you can do on the server side is for what I did with the banking application. Then I create kind of a filter for all the incoming transactions. And if it's the filter let in that transaction, so for example, it's matching the account number and the subscription was started saying it should match this account number, and then it's sent to the client via WebSockets.
Okay. So is it the back end that's setting up a GraphQL subscription, or is it still the front end saying, hey, I want you to subscribe to these things for me?
The front end is always starting it.
It's always
but then,
in
of course, on the back end, since it's a WebSocket, you get a stateful thing on the back end, the back end part.
Yeah. It kind of sounds a bit like KSQL DB to me, in which you set up these streaming queries that run constantly in the back end, but it's the client that defines them.
Yes.
I see that parallel. Yeah. That having worked with a lot of front and back end teams, I can see the back end saying, oh, we don't want to give up control to the front end, but we do want them to bother us less. There's a trade-off there, right? Interesting. So you've used this in production?
Kind of. Like,
tell me that story.
I think, I wanted to use it at some point, but then we used it at a hackathon. But then, especially for the streaming part, then it became much too complex for just one day to fix it in the cloud environment. So that was kind of a bummer, but then that was because the hackathon was on a production-like environment, so that was interesting. And I also did something for the Dutch National Police, but that was all already there before I came there, and then we also used GraphQL. But then GraphQL was used mostly server to server, and then I had a bit of my doubts about that.
Oh, that's interesting. Why would you use it server to server? Is it just yet another query layer to speak to different machines?
Yeah, kind of. And of course, you have still the overhead issue, but mostly on backend. Backend is mostly close together. So then the overhead doesn't really matter that much. And also the versioning, since you probably deploy all the servers yourself, or at least can see which version they are on, you are much more in control with deprecation. So then it also, in that case, also makes less sense. And it's getting pretty verbose. Like if you just use REST, you can just call the endpoints. And here you have to really specify all the fields you need. So and often the use case was that we want to have everything to put it in some other database. And then, everything that can be quite a huge thing. And then also if something changes and updates, of course, then you might run the risk of missing something.
Right.
Because they might update the schema at some field, but then you also have to update your schema or you have to update the query. Otherwise, you don't get that additional field.
Right, yeah. So there's always backwards compatible migration and forwards compatible, right?
Yes.
You want to be able to anticipate future changes. That is again that's reminding me of Avro, right?
Yes.
Migrations in Avro. It's not enough to think about a serialization format. You've got to think about change as well. Okay. So, do you think GraphQL is particularly suited to Kafka event streaming? Is it particularly suited to any backend? Is there a synergy there?
It might be used as part of a solution to help with scalability. Since, of course, with Kafka, you can just start multiple consumers spreading all those events, and then just for each consumer could consume potentially all the events, and then just you have a over an endpoint for each consumer, and then once they see such an event, and then set it to the one that's subscribed on the GraphQL endpoint. So I think it
Yeah,
could
right.
be part of scaling out.
Yes, yeah, I can see that. So you deploy every consumer with its own GraphQL.
Of course, if you want to do it smarter and you have really like a lot of messages, you would probably kind of want to direct people to the correct instance that only gets messages that might be related to them. But then it becomes a bit more complicated, and then probably just a custom WebSocket solution would be better, because then you're more in control of what you're sending to the clients.
Right. So you're not saying that GraphQL is the solution, just that it should be one of your options on the table.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So tell me, if I wanted to get started with it, where should I start? What's the best way to get learning this?
That's a good question. I don't really know anymore since I started for you. I know like Apollo is like a big company that's very big on GraphQL, so it has a lot of documentation and stuff. I think also like interactive playgrounds and stuff like that. So that would probably be a good place to start. Of course, you can also, if you really like documentation and to read things, you could also read the GraphQL specification. Some people like it. It's quite
Should I
easy to
confess
read.
at this point I
so-
have?
Yeah, so
I read it a few years ago for a project, and I would agree. It's not a bad read as specs go.
like if you really want to know what really GraphQL Zach is about, then I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, yeah. For specs, not too heavy and not too brief, it often is the best place to get started, right? And I was going to ask you, types. That's another question on my mind about GraphQL. Can you introspect the schema or like the types
So
of
for
different
example,
fields
if we
and
have
stuff?
names, then it could be a string. So then also on the client side, you know that it's a string. And for example, if you in your front end, if you use something like TypeScript and you generate your API based on the GraphQL schema, then you know this is a string and there are certain operations I can do on that. So
Okay.
that's really helping also compared to REST, where you sometimes can do it based on the open API specification and also generate something like that. But what I've seen in practice, I've not done that much front end, but then it's often just done by hand. Like I need this and
Yeah.
this fields, and I put them in a TypeScript definition because I know that's what I get back. But yeah,
Yeah. TypeScript
and it's
definitions
all
are
a
easy
bit,
to write, but
but then you have to maintain also. And I think
I could
especially
see.
with things like React, then there are really nice things that also do some state management and stuff like that. So if all your data
Okay.
is coming from GraphQL, you can kind of hook that into it, and then you get auto completion and stuff like that.
Oh, really? That could be an interesting side project. Because I've got this little hack I do with WebSockets and Kafka and Python and just straight WebSocket API. I might see if I can do something with GraphQL with that, because this sounds really interesting to me. Before we sort of wrap that up, any last tips for someone working with GraphQL? Anything to watch for?
There are some downsides on GraphQL. Most of them are, especially if you have a public API, and you don't really know what people are going to query for. So one of the most famous open GraphQLs is the one from GitHub. And I know they have like pretty some security things about it. So before they execute the query, they check how complex it is. And if it's too complex, you just get an error back. They don't send it to the back end and have it rambling on it. And then they just send it back. So that's one of the things.
So you could have this like BFF, you called it, backend for front end, acting as the police for your query. Is there any support in GraphQL for that, or do you just have to roll your own?
I think there's probably some community things with hanging about and like the complexity of a query.
Okay.
I haven't used it myself because I haven't worked on public APIs.
Okay.
But there are some talks from mainly GitHub and stuff how you can secure your public GraphQL API. So that's one of the concerns. Right.
I will see if we can get some of those put in the show notes so that people can find the links easily. Gerard, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I know that one of your other side projects is using Schema Registry and Rustlang. Yes. So maybe we can entice you back someday to talk about that.
Maybe. Yes.
Maybe so. Thank you very much, Gerard Klijs. Thank you for joining us on Streaming Audio.
Yes, thanks. Hi.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Streaming Audio. My guest today has been Gerard Klijs, and we've been talking about GraphQL. I've been Chris Jenkins, and I will continue to be in the next episode, so I hope you'll join me for that. If you've got any comments or questions, then please do drop us a line, and especially if you've got your own story to tell on a future episode, let us know about that. If you're listening to this, you'll find our contact details in the show notes of your podcasting app. And if you're watching it, there's probably a comment box just down there you could drop us a line with. So please do that. Your reminder that Streaming Audio is brought to you by Confluent Developer. That's developer.confluent.io, which is your one-stop shop for learning all about Apache Kafka, event streaming, and event-driven architectures. You'll find courses there, getting started guides, interviews with people who've really kicked the tires and put Kafka in production and seen what it's like in the trenches. And you'll also have the chance to go through various courses that will teach you in depth about how to work with Kafka. If you choose to sign up for one of those and you sign up for Confluent Cloud to run your Kafka instance, remember to use the podcast code, which is podcast100, and that will give you $100 worth of free credit. And with that, let me just once again thank Gerard for joining us, and thank you for listening.